Okay. Welcome. All right. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Can I wake you up? Welcome to the Socratic Forum. Let's see, our video guys, give me the heads up. Good to go. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 14th Annual Socratic Project at the City Colleges of Chicago, Olive Harvey College. We are excited that you're here. I am enthusiastic about this. Special thanks to the Society of Christian Philosophers, who, without their help, we would not be able to do this event tonight. Tonight we'll be debating and dialoguing on the perpetual theme of evolution, religion, and science. Is it possible that human beings, like other life forms, have developed without a purpose or a designer? From aboriginal unicellular life by such mechanisms as natural selection, genetic drift, working on sources of genetic variation. In short, is a designer necessary for the explanation of the complexity of life on Earth? That is a question we will be debating tonight. Sir Isaac Newton, in his Principia, Mathematics, Principles of Natural Philosophy, wrote, "The most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel of a dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." And Bill Gates, that name sound familiar? A little more recent. In his book, The Road Ahead, wrote, "DNA is like a computer program, far more advanced than any software ever created." However, Michael Shermer, who is head of the Skeptic Society, who I subscribe to, Why Darwin Matters, the Case Against Intelligent Design, in his book argues, which is more likely, that the universe was designed just for us, or that we see that the universe was designed just for us? In this series of debates, this is the 13th one we've done at the campus thus far. They're all controversial by nature. We've done things on global warming, terrorism, homosexuality, LGBT, etc. The one on LGBT got a lot hotter than the one on global warming. Matter of fact, when I did that debate, many people from across the district told me, shut that thing down. Do not allow these people to debate this topic. Which is ironic to me because this is coming from my liberal colleagues who champion liberal causes. And they're telling me not to allow people to debate on this topic. This is across the board happening all over the United States. Now, we are not Berkeley, but this has happened at Berkeley. I'm just glad there are no debaters outside threatening you with violence for even coming in here. There are people petitioning for this debate not to even go forward. So please give a round of applause for our debaters who are brave enough to come over here and debate this topic. I struggled for many years trying to get people on the consensus side to debate the issues. And I'm glad that people are here today to do that. And thank you for joining me in that process. I just do not want our classrooms to turn into echo chambers where our platonic caves become our comfort zones, where we live in our ignorance rather than hearing the other side. I'm a firm proponent that if somebody's wrong, if you let them talk long enough, they'll put their whole foot in their mouth. And John Stuart Mill, in his work on liberty, argues that there are three types of truth. There's the truth, something that is true, there's the false, and then there's that which has both sides, which we're not sure of. So, how do you determine which one is which? You allow them the ability to discuss and debate, that's how. And the wrong one will end up destabilizing his own position. Hopefully that doesn't happen too much of an embarrassment for our speakers. But I'll let you decide as you move on. Welcome back to the debate again. I will be moderating the debate and going through a specific period of process on it, where there'll be question and answer time from you at the end. So prepare your questions as we'll be going around Oprah style, allowing you to ask yours. Afterwards, there'll be a short reception for our speakers, which you're welcome to join us for some hors d'oeuvres afterwards. With that said, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. Our two debaters tonight are accomplished scholars in their own right. The first one is biochemist Fuz Rana. He was a senior scientist in research and development at Procter & Gamble. Fuzz graduated with highest honors from West Virginia State College, now University, with a BS in chemistry, and went on to earn his PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University, where he was twice awarded the Donald Clippinger Research Award. He pursued postdoctoral studies in biophysics of cell membranes at the Universities of Virginia and Georgia. Several articles by Fuzz have been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, such as Biochemistry, Applied Stereoscopy, FEBS Letters, Journal of Microbiological Methods, Journal of Chemical Education. He has also delivered numerous presentations in international scientific meetings. He also holds 2 patents, authored a chapter on molecular convergence and intelligent design in the Nature of Nature, and co-wrote chapters on antimicrobial pesticides. Is it peptides? Excuse me, peptides. For biological and synthetic membranes. You can tell that's not my field. Fuzz addresses topics of science, faith, and hot topics, such as Creating Life in a Lab, which is the name of his book, which should be available outside, and the cells design as well. With numerous articles, podcasts, television, radio interviews, etc., we are privileged to have him here today. He has spoken at over 500 universities. Please welcome Fuzz Rana. Stanly Chon is professor of biology at DePaul University. Have you heard of that college? Just down the street, right? Where he is involved in teaching general biology, cell biology, senior capstone courses, and science education courses, as well as doing investigations into ecological conditions affecting the movement of cells. He received his BS in chemistry with honors from Caltech and PhD for molecular, cellular, and developmental biology from the University of Colorado, and completed postdoctoral studies on the proteins involved in intercellular movements of materials at the National Jewish Center for Respiratory Medicine, now National Jewish Health, in Denver, Colorado. He has published numerous articles on his research in peer-reviewed journals, such as Nature, Journal of Cell Biology, Journal of Biological Chemistry, Journal of Psychological and Diatomic, how do you pronounce that, Professor?
Diatom.
Thank you, sir. Diatom Research. He is a member of the Public International Committee of the American Society for Cell Biology. He was a recipient of the Royal Society for Arts Silver Medal at DePaul University Excellence on Teaching Award. Please welcome Dr. Stanly Chon. We have a 15-minute opening by Dr. Fuzz Rana, and which will be followed by 15 minutes by Dr. Stanly Chon. Please give your attention to Dr. Rana.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, it really is a pleasure, and it's really an honor to be here with you this afternoon to talk about what I think to be a really important question, and that is there evidence for a supernatural creator in nature? And I'm going to take the affirmative position that the answer is yes. There is evidence for a supernatural creator in nature. And the first thing I need to do before I establish this particular point is to address a very important question, and that is, can science detect the work of an intelligent agent in nature? Does science have the toolkit to detect intelligent design? And I'm going to argue the answer to that question is yes, by simply pointing out that there are a number of scientific disciplines that in effect are intelligent design disciplines. Forensic science, the science of crime scene investigation. We can utilize scientific methods and go to a crime scene and determine through science whether or not a dead body is the result of natural processes or the work of a malevolent intelligent agent. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, is predicated on the capacity of astronomers to distinguish between an intelligent civilization or natural process generating electromagnetic radiation in our galaxy or even in different parts of our universe. And then finally, archaeology is an intelligent design discipline. Archaeologists can determine whether or not a rock was shaped by natural processes or by the work of a hominin, a creature like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, or even modern humans. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how archaeology indeed is an intelligent design discipline by looking at something called the Socratic Mastodon site. This is a mastodon archaeological site that was discovered in 1992 outside of San Diego, California. And this is near where I live, and so I was interested in this particular find. Caltrans was doing road work, and as part of the excavation process came upon mastodon remains, called in a team of archaeologists who characterized the site and determined that those mastodon remains were processed by what they thought to be modern humans. But they were unable to date the site until just a few years ago, when they were able to date the site, and they just published the results of that dating work a few months ago, and they determined that the site dates at 130,000 years in age, which is shocking because modern humans didn't make their way into the Americas until 15,000 years ago, which meant that 115,000 years before modern humans made their way into the Americas, we have evidence for some kind of hominin processing mastodon remains at that site, presumably Neanderthals. Because this was so controversial, these researchers had to make sure every I was dotted and T was crossed to build their case. And so what they did was essentially first establish that there was the appearance of design at the site by looking at the arrangement of the bones and the rock, or the cobble that was used to process those remains. They also noted that there were markings on the bones and on the rock that looked as if they were non-natural, that resulted from somebody taking a rock and striking the mastodon femur. They then ruled out every possible natural process explanation. For example, scavenging of the mastodon remains by wild animals, to conclude that this must indeed be the product of hominin activity. And then finally, they went into the lab and they reproduced the fracture patterns on the bones of an elephant and on the bones of a cow using a rock, showing that, again, they could produce those identical fracture patterns on the bones and the markings on the cobble or the rock. And this illustrates that intelligent design is already an integral part of the scientific enterprise. But it also is laying out a roadmap for how we can explore biological systems to determine whether or not an intelligent agent is responsible for biological systems. And I'm going to focus on biochemical systems since this is my area of expertise, and I'm going to argue that we see the appearance of design when we look at biological systems. That when we try to account for those systems through chemical evolution, we see that those explanations fall short, and that when we go into a lab and try to reproduce or recapitulate a process of chemical evolution, we see intelligent agency plays a critical role. And then finally, I'm going to argue that an intelligent design approach to science actually is a very fruitful, productive way to drive new technologies. Let's go ahead and take a look at the appearance of design. One of the things that I find remarkable as a biochemist was that biochemical systems have the hallmark characteristics of systems produced by human designers. In other words, when we design, when we create, when we invent systems or objects or devices as human beings, those have certain properties, telltale signatures that specify the work of an intelligent designer. And we see those same features characterizing biochemical systems. And so by analogy, we would argue that if human designers produce certain properties in systems, and we see those same properties in cellular systems, then this should suggest the work of an intelligent agent. Moreover, some biochemical systems are direct analogs to man-made systems, to man-made constructs. And so this similarity allows us to breathe a new life, to reinvigorate the watchmaker argument for God's existence, developed by William Paley in the late 1700s, in which Paley argued that a watch has certain properties that reflect the work of a watchmaker, and biological systems share those properties, therefore they must be the work of a divine watchmaker. To illustrate how this argument can be made in contemporary terms, let's consider a very important insight that's been developed recently by biochemists and computer scientists, in which they recognize that the fundamental operations of a computer system are identical to those chemical processes in the cell involved in DNA metabolism during DNA replication, transcription, or DNA repair. In fact, this similarity is so startling that it actually has inaugurated a new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing. And this is a picture of Leonard Adleman, a computer scientist at the University of Southern California, who's considered the father of DNA computing. And this is what Adleman said about DNA computing in an interview. The most important thing about DNA computing is that it shows that DNA molecules can do what we normally think only computers can do. This implies that computer science and biology are closely related, that every living thing can be thought to be computing something, and that sometimes we can understand living things better by looking at them as computers. We also note that in order to explain biochemical systems through an evolutionary process, we are now in the domain of the origin of life question. And there are three major lines of models that have been developed in advance to explain the origin of life and hence the origin of biochemical systems through natural processes. They're called replicator first, metabolism first, and membrane first scenarios. And this afternoon, I'm not going to go into details other than to say all three approaches have met with failure in terms of accounting for the origin of biochemical systems. For example, Leslie Orgel, when he was alive, was considered one of the world's preeminent origin of life researchers. He's the father of the RNA world hypothesis, the quintessential replicator first scenario. And he said this: "It would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth. Legion are the problems with replicator first scenarios." With regard to metabolism first scenarios, Orgel was noted as saying, they require an appeal to magic, a series of remarkable coincidences, a near miracle. And then finally, a few years ago, a colleague of mine and I wrote an article, a critical review of membrane-first scenarios for the origin of life that was published in OLAB, Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres, where we argue that no approach to explaining the origin of life through membrane-first scenarios withstands critical scrutiny. And then finally, when we go into the lab and we try to recapitulate the steps that would be needed to generate life through chemical evolution, what we see is very clear evidence intelligent agency is required. And this area of work is referred to as prebiotic chemistry. Researchers have been successful over the last 65 years of going into the lab and performing experiments in which they can identify different chemical and physical processes that in principle could contribute to the origin of life, and hence the origin of biochemical systems through natural process mechanisms. The problem is that these laboratory experiments are done under highly controlled, carefully orchestrated conditions, where it becomes evident that the researcher is actually playing a vital and necessary role in bringing about the chemical or physical transformations. And as soon as you try to imagine those chemical and physical processes happening under the conditions of the early Earth, where the conditions are uncontrolled and chemically and physically complex, that chemistry no longer is reasonable, no longer is productive. In fact, Simon Conway Morris, in his book Life Solutions, says this: "Many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God." So what I've shown you in these few minutes is that when we look at biochemical systems, they have the appearance of design. That when we try to account for these systems and their origin through natural process mechanisms, we wind up hitting dead ends. And then finally, when we go in the lab and we try to recapitulate the process needed to bring about the origin of life, intelligent agency is required. This is the same line of reasoning that the archaeologists at the Sereti Mastodon site used to establish the presence of Neanderthals in the Americas 130,000 years ago. But I'm going to also point out, as I bring my opening statement to a close, that intelligent design is a very fruitful framework to drive new biotechnologies. And there are two areas in which we actually see this playing out. Synthetic biology and an area called biomimetics and bioinspiration, which I would argue are intelligent design research programs. Synthetic biology is the attempt to create artificial cells or to re-engineer life forms into new, novel, non-natural organisms. And when we examine both the creation of protocells and the re-engineering of life, what becomes immediately evident is how central intelligent agency is in that re-engineering process or in the generation of protocells, reinforcing a conclusion that we just drew a few minutes ago, but also illustrating that intelligent design is really a fruitful area of research that can drive technology development. Biomimetics and bioinspiration is another area in which researchers will utilize designs in biology to inspire new technology. And for example, with respect to the DNA molecule, DNA is so optimized for its role in information storage in the cell that it has literally inspired 3 new areas of nanotechnology: the use of polymeric systems to store digital data, DNA computing, which we just talked about, and nanoelectronics, where DNA can serve as a nanomolecular scale wire. Now, not only does this illustrate, again, intelligent design can be a fruitful way to drive technology advance, but it also raises questions about the capacity of evolution to account for these kind of biochemical systems. Because the evolutionary mechanism is unguided, undirected, blind, co-opting existing designs, cobbling them together to produce new designs. And the expectation is that evolutionary mechanisms are going to produce flawed designs, as Ken Miller argued in an article in Technology Review. That is, evolution produces kludged systems. And so this raises a question, because if systems in biology are produced through this evolutionary process, then you would not expect them to be worthwhile as models for developing new types of technology. Is it reasonable to think that biochemical systems represent the outworkings of unguided, historically contingent processes that co-opt pre-existing designs to kludge together new systems, and at the same time for them to inspire new technology? So what we've shown is this, that when we look at biochemical systems, they have the appearance of design. Chemical evolution can't account for these systems. Creating life in the lab requires intelligent agency, and a creation or design approach to biology is a fruitful endeavor. That is, in short, there is evidence for a supernatural creator in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rana. The rest of you, there are other people coming in. If you could start making your way in, those of you who are sitting on the edge a little bit in, I would appreciate that. There are some other people coming in trying to find seats, and they're having a hard time. Could you please start moving inward a little bit? Thank you. Also, a little bit of a shout out to our president who supported this event. Please give her a round of applause. Dr. Stanly Chon.
Hi, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I want to start by thanking very much Dr. Swice and Olive Harvey College for inviting me to join Dr. Raza to be part of this wonderful opportunity tonight to engage students such as yourselves in these important questions surrounding our humanity. I did want to start by just letting you know I don't have a PowerPoint. Every time I use one in class, the students just say, I see the power, but what's the point? So you'll have to listen to my words. Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, once said, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity and delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, world without end? Ever since the dawn of human consciousness, one of our biggest questions has been, what is our place in the world? Where did we come from? What makes us who we are? And what is our relationship with the myriad other organisms we see in the world around us? And how do we put that relationship on Facebook? I know, best to probably be it's complicated. Science has a clear answer for the biological aspect of that question: evolution. Geology, anthropology, genetics, molecular biology, even astrobiology have all shown overwhelming and decisive evidence that organisms arrive from the persistent, stepwise, random but selected modification from previous life forms. The fossil record, DNA comparison, biogeography of organisms, the correlation of genetic changes with an organism or population's behavioral and structural changes, which have often been shown to correlate directly with the organism's environment. All of these show that populations and organisms develop discrete modifications over time that are garnered from their prior populations and selected for with the environmental conditions. This continuous stretch of life reaches all the way back to the earliest organisms. Each organism carries a large number of cell and genetic structures and processes that are similar to all other living organisms on Earth, while at the same time having particular genes and regulatory mechanisms that are unique to each individual species. All organisms have cell membranes, DNA to copy and transmit information, and rely on similar metabolic pathways. So how did this myriad of species that we see come about? It's important first to note that the concept of species is not as concrete as usually thought. While species normally are considered to be organisms that mate just with other members of their own species, there have been observations on flies, birds, and other small mammals that have shown that at low frequencies there are matings of individuals of closely related organisms, these closely related species that can yield viable and vibrant hybrid offspring. These hybrids carry some of the unique DNA of both parental species and can often have ecological success that exceeds the parental species. This kind of mixing and modification and transfer of DNA through closely related species, along with gene duplication and rearrangement and mutation, occurs in low but regular basis during reproduction, and it allows the generation of a high degree of genetic variation within populations of organisms. It is upon this variation that is within it's this variation of individuals within a population that the burden of natural selection is placed. Individuals that survive environmental conditions well enough will reproduce and make more of their kind. But ecological conditions are not static. And the environment changes, and so do species using selective pressures. Thus, individual organisms with better adapted features for any current conditions reproduce better and have more of their offspring in future generations. It's also important to realize that natural selection doesn't mean survival of the fittest, but survival of the fit enough. An organism only has to be adapted enough to make it through the next generation with progeny that can also reproduce. Like other animals, all we ever want are good kids who write and call occasionally. Okay. All right. Observations of the fossil record, as well as existing organisms, suggest that genes can be altered and selected in a wide variety of ways, and that the accumulation over time of organisms with greater complexity and abilities is easily within the scope and the process of natural selection. No deity or external creator is necessary to generate the amazing display of biochemical and physiological reactions that are seen in the diversity of life. What about the patterns we see? One of the central questions of tonight's event is whether the patterns we see in structures of genes of organisms are simply random results of long-term systematic evolution, or are they indicative of some larger scale creator such as God? While such proofs of external deity are impossible within science, I can say without any hesitation that the patterns we see are completely possible within the processes of evolution and natural selection. Avoiding for the moment the arguments on the purely religious foundation, many of the arguments given by those who say the complexity and patterns we see cannot be generated naturally center on four basic ideas. One, that things are so amazing and so well integrated with each other that they couldn't have occurred naturally. Two, that stepwise changes in structure or behavior have never been directly observed. Three, that stepwise changes might allow for microevolution, but they cannot drive that macroevolution or changes in major body form. Or that four, everything we as humans create have patterns associated with them, and therefore whenever we see a pattern, it's likely to be a sign that there's a similar creator involved in the process. So let me take these arguments one by one. The idea that a creator is necessary to make anything that's too amazing for us to imagine is naturally as old as the human society. Rain, thunder, volcanoes, eclipses, snow, they were all thought at one time to be the direct acts of an interventionist God until we advanced enough in our scientific understanding of the world to be able to explain electricity, plate tectonics, meteorology, and planetary movement, all of which follow very precise, predictable patterns defined by physics. These constants that drive these reactions, the gravitational constants, the nuclear force constants, the electrical attraction constants, all of them are immutable. Just like the Cubs pattern of 2 consecutive World Series every 108 years. Okay. All right. This old idea that being too amazing for natural development has often been used in biology under the concept of irreducible complexity. Creation proponents often point to some structure or molecular machine or biochemical pathway and say this is too complex for us to understand, too complex to have been generated in some accumulated process, and therefore it must have been put in place by a creator with a plan. But like the ideas of old, this is more an aspect of our lack of science knowledge than true irreducibility. There are numerous, the bacterial flagella, the eukaryotic cilia, the retina of an eye, all of these have been used as examples at times of irreducible complexity, but each in turn have been found to be quite reducible. There are numerous known mutations of proteins making up cilia flagella, all of which allow them to work, only not quite as well. There are structures that are similar to many of these different components of all of these machines used elsewhere in the cell for slightly different purposes. And once particular structures are indeed found to be reducible, at least into a few functional components, often skeptics of evolution move on to other structures that again see simply too complex or amazing for them. The second argument, that observed changes in the structure of organisms tied to ecology have never been observed, directly contradicts many lines of evidence. Ask those who have worked on evolution in fruit flies or finches or fish, and they'll tell you that measurable changes in fins or scales or beaks or body size can be directly observed with correlation to changes in their environmental conditions. Changes like food sources, water conditions, or even changes in predation. Populations of guppies were shown to directly change coloration and patterning in response to different conditions within the same stream. I had the great fortune to be able to go to the Galapagos Islands this summer and witness amazing things for myself. Closely located islands, all of which have been generated by volcanic activity far away from the mainland, resulting in each having their own unique set of organisms and ecosystems on them. There was a cormorant species that, in the absence of a predator, no longer has the ability to fly. A crab that in the absence of a predator now has very brightly colored shell as an adult, easily able to be detected from miles off. Finches with beaks that have just the right beak for seeds and nuts on each kind of island. And the Galapagos appears to be the only location of marine iguanas, a reptile that's learned to extract food from the sea. On the Galapagos, one of the early sites of Darwin's ideas, there are researchers who have found that changes in the island ecology, such as drought, can within only a few generations cause dramatic shifts in the populations of birds with particular attributes that are most suited to the kind of fauna. They could have shifts in structural, behavioral attributes of the birds, and these correlate with minor genetic variations between the species. These small changes in genes and the resulting outcomes of those changes can occur quite rapidly. Moreover, when an island is under stress conditions, and those rare hybrids between species I talked about earlier can normally die out quickly, sometimes they can be more viable and more robust than the original species. For example, recently, researchers have seen that in the case of a parasite that's killing off some of the finches, there are populations of finches that seem resistant to this parasite. And genetically, these appear to be some of the same kind of hybrids that I talked about from two other much more susceptible species. New subspecies can often appear quickly in response to very strong stressful conditions. The rate at which natural genetic variation is generated within organisms we know now to be startlingly fast. By selecting for variations in bacteria or flies or worms, scientists observed that novel structures, biochemical changes, or even behaviors can be selected for in short periods of time. Even in mammalian cells, if you track the genetics of cancers or viruses or other kinds of disease cells over time, you can see that these cells can generate changes in genetic diversity over mere weeks or months. In short, scientists now have abundant evidence for microevolution and natural selection based on the environment directly observed over measurable time frames. But what about macroevolution? Even here, modern developmental biologists and evolutionary biologists have joined hand in recent years to show how small genetic changes can often yield larger developmental consequences. Scientists have much more understanding of common regulatory genes controlling the development across many kinds of animals. There are body segmentation, wings, arms, limbs, digits. All of these seem to be regulated not only by particular structural genes, but also by regulatory genes and proteins that turn them on and off. Small changes in the regulatory genes can cause the appearance of limbs or additional body segments. In some cases, changes in morphology can allow one adaptation to be used for another one. Feathers appeared likely as a form of lightweight insulation, but in those animals which had them extensively on their limbs, gliding and then flight was possible. Evolution is in fact much like those word games one often sees where you change one word into another, changing one letter at a time, each creating a functional word, like shape to piece in 7 steps. You know, shape, shake, stake, state, slate, plate, place, piece. And Lord knows we all need some more peace right now. At the end of the day, evolution relies only on reproductive success, allowing each random change that makes you a bit more fit, or at least not less fit, to be put into place, and building on what is already there. And therefore, whatever form it is that works for that organism, it's okay. The processes that generate the variation are random, and the selection among those variations is based on whatever form's available that works well enough to get you some viable and fertile progeny. Now, for the last postulate of the creationists that I mentioned, the existence of that a pattern indicates a patterner, a creator. Humans are in fact suited to detecting patterns. There are areas of our brain that are specifically designed to observe and detect patterns and similarities. Areas that detect faces, regularity in structures, similarities between what you observed now and what you observed before. We revel in designing and determining patterns. It's one of our greatest evolutionary adaptations. We not only use the things around us as tools, we plan, design, and forge our own tools. But just because virtually anything that humans create looks orderly and organized does not mean that anything that looks orderly must therefore have been created by a more advanced creator. For example, one such presumed type of organization that some people talk about is redundancy. You'll often get evolutionary skeptics who say that redundancies one observes in types of genes, processes, or biochemical pathways is a sign that there must be a creator. That evolution tends to streamline things, not broaden and duplicate them. However, molecular biology and comparison of genomes now from different organisms shows that the process of gene duplication and the modification of one of those duplicates may drive the expansion of evolution and increase in complexity. This gene duplication caused by slight errors in copying DNA are common, and with genetic flexibility among different genes and common selective pressures, it's quite likely that the cell would develop redundant and duplicative processes to carry out reactions. The same works for convergent evolution. Some say that a sign of systematic evolution is invalid, but in fact redundancies help support the idea of evolution. It shows when there's common selective pressures that even if there's enough genetic flexibility over time, you will get highly competitive environments, and plants and animals can develop similar characteristics like similar coloration to help them in camouflage to avoid predation. Ultimately, the fact is that conjectures based solely on anecdotal evidence, lack of knowledge, or personal presumptions are not science but belief. They're not science until they're developed into hypotheses that can be tested via reproducible, repeated experimentation and observation. Without such process of comparing results and observation, the ideas are not part of scientific canon. They're simply beliefs and opinions trying to be couched in the vocabulary of science.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. This is a clip from the movie Noah in 2004, and the dialogue you'll be hearing is the Genesis account narrated by Russell Crowe. We'll play a little bit of that and we'll come back into the debate.
There was nothing. Nothing but the silence of an infinite darkness. But the breath of the Creator fluttered against the face of the void, whispering, "Let there be light." And light was. And it was good. The first day. And then the formless light began to take on substance and shape. The second day. And our world was born. Our beautiful, fragile home. And a great warming light nurtured its days. And a lesser light ruled the nights. And there was evening and morning. Another day. And the waters of the world gathered together. And in their midst emerged dry land. Another day passed. And the ground put forth the growing things. A thick blanket of green stretching across all creation. And the waters, too, teemed with life. Great creatures of the deep that are no more. Vast multitudes of fish, some of which may still swim beneath these seas. And soon, the sky was streaming with birds. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fifth day. Now the whole world was full of living beings. Everything that creeps, everything that crawls, and every beast that walks upon the ground. And it was good. It was all good. There was light and air and water and soil, all clean and unspoiled. There were plants and fish and fowl and beast, each after their own kind, all part of the greater whole, all in their place, and all was in balance. It was paradise, the jewel in the Creator's palm. And the Creator made man, and by his side woman, father and mother of us all. He gave them a choice. Follow the temptation of darkness, or hold on to the blessing of light. But they ate from the forbidden fruit. Their innocence was extinguished. And so for the 10 generations since Adam's sin has walked within us. brother against brother, nation against nation, man against creation. We murdered each other. We broke the world. We did this. Man did this. Everything that was beautiful, everything that was good, we shattered.
Everything that was good, we shattered. That is the closing line of that small clip that you saw there from the Noah film. This is the general narrative that's given to us in our culture from the biblical story of the Genesis account. The question is it true? So I'm going to be opening up the discussion at this point between the two professors. The discussion will be between, first we'll give 5 minutes to engage Professor Chon, and Professor Chon will also have some time to engage Dr. Rana. And of course, they may go back and forth, but I'll leave that open to them. Dr. Rana, you can begin.
Dr. Chon, I have a question that at this juncture is more maybe philosophical than scientific. What role do you see methodological naturalism playing in this conversation, in this dialogue? Do you think that methodological naturalism is by definition excluding the real possibility of intelligent design contributing to our understanding of origins?
May I interject, Dr. Rana? Would you define methodological naturalism for our audience?
Yes. Methodological naturalism is a philosophical idea that undergirds the contemporary scientific process, which basically argues that science can only pursue mechanistic natural process explanations, that any explanation that evokes the work of intelligent agency is excluded by definition from the scientific process. So it's distinguished from philosophical naturalism that says no God exists. But when you adopt methodological naturalism, you are, in a pragmatic sense, functioning as an atheist as you do science, because you, regardless of your belief, one way or the other, as to whether or not God exists, you pragmatically are functioning like an atheist. Sometimes it's called provisional atheism or benchtop atheism. So.
Well, I wouldn't say that, what's the best way to put this? I think methodological naturalism is required for science, and I think basically the things that are outside that are not testable under the normal scientific method. Does it exclude, I mean, it excludes all those things which are inherently assumes that non-natural events are behind them. Yes, I would say that's true for science. I mean, I think methodological naturalism is at the root of science, and I think that it shows those things which have reproducibility and regularity in a natural sense that are testable.
But then how would you account for disciplines like archaeology or SETI or...
Well, so the idea is that, so archaeology looks for patterns, but patterns do not mean supernatural patterns. I mean, looking for things which have regularity or have design to them does not inherently say that there are supernatural reasons behind those designs.
Yeah, well, so for example...
I mean, SETI is looking for intelligent design, I should say, designs and patterns of intelligent life, but it does not in any way necessarily put that design in terms of a supernatural creator. It's looking for designs, but design and patterning in and of itself is not necessarily a sign of a creator.
Right, but for example, you could, I mean, but if you can detect design when you're looking at electromagnetic radiation, then why couldn't you detect design using that same toolkit in biological systems. And
Well, you can't. I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, for example, in archaeology, you can, when you look at, for example, tools made out of stone, you can infer quite a bit about what the capacity and the capability of that agent must have been that was capable of shaping that stone, right? And likewise, with SETI, for example, there was astronomers from Harvard University that were looking at something called fast radio bursts, where they basically were arguing, well, this is perhaps some kind of propulsion system that an alien intelligence was using to propel spacecraft across their portion of the galaxy. And in their presentation, which is published in the scientific literature, they were discussing the motivation and the capacity of this alien intelligence. And so, granted, in both examples, you're looking at intelligence that's natural, if you will.
Yes.
But why could you not extrapolate that to intelligence that would exceed our natural capabilities? It seems like methodological naturalism is creating an artificial restriction on science, that science isn't about discovering truth, it's about discovering a mechanism to explain something, whether or not that mechanism turns out to be valid.
Well, I actually think it's the other way around. I think that putting in potential explanations that are beyond naturalism tends to restrict your ability to be able to focus on particular experimentations that may prove more naturalistic reasonings behind it. See, archaeology and SETI and things like that can detect patterns, and we can detect patterns. I mean, we can detect patterns in DNA or cells. We can see the complexities. We can see the amount of patterns. But the question that you had related to that of how much pattern is in there is really, how can you ever say that, how would you ever be able to prove that a particular amount of design or pattern was more than could be done naturally?
Okay.
That's what I don't think is possible.
The tables now will turn. It's your turn to ask the questions, Professor. But keep in mind, I'm going a little bit of leeway on some of the time to give some more robust conversation.
So I wanted to kind of come back to one of the things you were talking about before, which is the idea of the origin of life, because clearly that's one of the issues that people talk about. Again, as many people have said, so origin of life is separate from evolution. Once you have a self-replicating organism, evolutionary mechanisms can take hold. But in thinking about the origin of life, actually scientists over the last 5-10 years have started to make a lot of very interesting kinds of research. And I would say for the most part, the people in that, although they don't have the details yet, would probably, in the sense of the ones that you have, say a replicator first is probably the way that it happened. That is, most scientists now, in many ways, looking at activities would say that RNA and the way that RNA replicates is probably the way things started. And there's been a number of scientists, there's been a couple of great groups at Scripps that have shown how particular types of chemicals in the glyoxylate pathway can be used to give much higher frequencies than the earlier kinds of people in who were looking at the more the formaldehyde kind of reactions, and they were getting much higher frequencies, and that they could see that RNA could be made. They know that RNA can replicate itself. I mean, can have enzymatic and reactions, and in fact, investigations into how the ribosome is a machine that helps replicate materials. That the RNA in ribosomes actually carries out many of the kinds of functions. So
Professor, Mr. Rana, you want to respond? I don't want to give him a chance.
Yeah, well, I was in July at the 18th International Conference on the Origin of Life held at UC San Diego. So I spent a week hanging out with Origin of Life researchers, listening to the cutting edge. And so, for example, you're making reference to the Sunderland reaction, and that is a reaction in which you can generate nucleotides, which are the building blocks, ribonucleotides, which are the building blocks of RNA, in a 5-step reaction. So it's very remarkable chemistry. But when you examine the reaction scheme, it suffers from the problem that I pointed out in my opening statement. That is, it only is possible under these contrived, highly controlled conditions in the laboratory. For example, it's absolutely critical to have phosphate in that system in order for that reaction to occur. And the big problem is that we don't have a source of phosphate on the early Earth. Phosphate is so insoluble that it simply is not going to exist at very high levels on the early Earth in an accessible form. This is actually called the phosphate problem and was recognized decades ago, a couple decades ago, by Stanley Miller himself, and was a point of discussion at the Origin of Life meeting where people were trying to work around that phosphate problem. Also, that reaction requires UV radiation at the final step to essentially destroy side products. And yet if you used UV radiation at any other step in the process, it would essentially shut down the chemistry. Well, you can't appeal to UV radiation on the Earth rescuing that reaction because it would be continuously impinging on the Earth. So you can't just have UV radiation at a selective step. So while an interesting reaction that is fascinating from an Origin of Life perspective, it doesn't translate to the conditions of the early Earth, or the creation of ribozymes in a laboratory with in vitro evolution. That's another example of intelligent design. Those systems are intelligently designed to use evolutionary principles to generate interesting ribozymes, but those chemical processes in the lab simply wouldn't be available on the early Earth. So I think most Origin of Life researchers would readily acknowledge that we don't have an explanation for the origin of life. And the reason I started there with the origin of life is because you're dealing with the generation of the first cell, and you're dealing with the basic systems of life, biochemical systems. And in my view, if you can establish that those systems display design using the criteria of the Sereti mastodon site, then I think you're justified in viewing all of biology from a design framework. And I would contend that many of the things you're pointing out that are features that compel an evolutionary interpretation could actually be understood from a design framework equally as well.
Okay. Did you want to quickly follow up to that? Because I got some questions here for both of you. Okay, there is a philosophy of religion and in the area of design theory. The question of the watch Paley, or Paley's watch analogy, which is a classic design argument. And the classic argument goes as follows. If you find design, you by default find a designer. So that's the question I'll have for you, Professor Stanley Chon. If there is design, we automatically infer a designer in almost every area of our lives, whether it's in archaeology, whether it's in SETI, or even crime labs. We assume the person is not killed by accident or suicide. There was some kind of external force that did that. That is the standard model. If we find design in the DNA molecule, for example, which many researchers like Bill, the inventor of Microsoft, its name escapes me. Bill Gates says DNA molecule is more advanced than any software that we have. It actually has information in it. So that seems to generate the hypothesis that there is a designer. Of course, we can start postulating who that is, but what is your response to saying why that theory or that argument may be flawed in its premises?
Well, the basic idea is that anytime you see anything that's remarkable or has patterning, that it assumes somebody created that pattern. But the fact is that's not necessarily true. You could take one of the examples that I can think is you can think of things like magnets, and you can organize them in different ways, and they're organizing themselves. I mean, it's due to an inherent property of the metals. It's not due to you making them stick together in any particular way. They can go from an unstuck to a stuck state. But the point, and DNA certainly has patterns as well. So the idea is that by stepwise selection, you can optimize patterns. I mean, if you are selecting for something that makes it through, if there are particular plants or whatever organisms that some animals can eat and some animals can't, the ones that can eat them will survive. The ones that can't will die out. And then by developing, if through replication they have all of a sudden more complex plants sprout up, those animals that have those ability to do that will do it as well. The key is that DNA you can start with DNA as a relatively random process, and it's a very slow stepwise change is selected for all the time. So the idea is that you're optimizing by taking, if you will, the early ones are prototypes. And so you are selectively looking at more and more refinement as you go along. So the fact that there are patterns and that you end up with things that are highly optimized does not mean that somebody optimized them outside of the fact that they were selected for simply surviving.
Interesting. You want to follow up with that, Dr. Rana?
No, I'll go ahead and just...
Okay. Yeah, it's a fascinating question. We keep bringing back up over and over again in our classes and dealing with the question of design. Question for you, Dr. Rana. The Genesis account, as laid out in the ancient scriptures in the Torah, specifically in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, I believe chapter 2 also encompasses it. Is this account to be taken literally? Is this account a scientific account, which many people seem to say is a pattern that we need to follow literally? How do you read the Genesis account? And piggybacking on that, many caricatures of faith is that faith is just an emotional response or a belief based on no evidence at all, just kind of like a leap in the dark. So there are two patterns, there are two types of questions I'm hitting you with. How would you address those?
Let me tell you a little bit of a story. When I was in college, I was an agnostic. And I remember, this was in the 1980s, this was when the Brown versus the Board of Education trial was happening in Arkansas. And I grew up in West Virginia, which is part of the Bible Belt. And so my biology professors were concerned that what was happening in Arkansas would happen in West Virginia. So they became, many of them, advocates for promoting evolution education in high school and obviously in university settings. And what they were reacting to was a view called young earth creationism. So even though I was an agnostic, I was engaged in conversations with many fellow students who were from Christian backgrounds who would talk about the Genesis 1 account. And I can remember that was the first time that I read Genesis 1 was when I was a sophomore or junior in college. And it was remarkable to me because when I read the account, I saw this remarkable correspondence between what Genesis 1 was describing and the scientific record for the Earth's history and life's history. And I remember arguing with one of my friends, well, why couldn't the word day just be a period of time as opposed to 24 hours? So this was a naive perspective I had as an agnostic with no exposure to Christianity. And I later converted to Christianity when I was a graduate student. And the first thing I did is I went back and reread Genesis 1, and again was impressed with that correspondence. So the view I take when I look at Genesis 1 is that it is a literal history, but that day is a period of time. In fact, in the original Hebrew, that word translated as day can be translated as a period of time. That's one of the meanings. So I would read Genesis 1 literally, but I see it as having some remarkable scientific prescience, if you will, seemingly to anticipate discoveries about Earth's history and life's history. So my point is that you could take the biblical creation accounts seriously, you could read them literally, and do it so in such a way that is integrous to the text and what the original author intended, but yet at the same time in a way that harmonizes with scientific advance And so there's no conflict between not only science and religion in a broad sense, or science and Christianity, but even between science and a literal reading of Genesis 1 and 2.
So add to that, give us an example of how an account in the Genesis model would reconcile with current scientific models.
Real quickly, the first two verses of Genesis 1, Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 are remarkable. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth. And in the original Hebrew, heavens and earth are translated from a Hebrew expression, shamayim aretz, which means the totality of creation. So here we have this statement that seems to affirm Big Bang cosmology. Genesis 1:2 is a depiction of the earth in its primordial state. It was dark. If you were a hypothetical observer on the surface of the earth, you would see nothing but darkness. The earth would be a water world, and it was a harsh, hostile environment. That's what the original Hebrew is implying. And this, again, is a remarkable depiction of what we think the early earth to be like. It would have been a water world. There would have been darkness everywhere initially because of the debris in the solar system preventing sunlight from reaching the surface of the earth. And the earth was experiencing impact events that would have created a place of desolation. So the first two verses in Genesis 1 are remarkable in terms of how well they correspond with what we think about the beginning of the universe and what we think about the very early stages of our planet's history.
Okay, interesting. You have a rejoinder to that?
Well, I think that Genesis shows a general sense of going from chaos to order, but I'm not sure that you can actually attribute everything that's in there to actual scientific, the order of actual scientific production. And I'm not sure that Shemayim Ba'aretz is quite translated usually as the totality of things.
Okay. Well, let me take off my professor hat and put on my student hat. What's the matter with you? How could you deny God made the universe?
Oh, is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question.
How can I deny? I don't deny anything. I'm actually.
I know. I wasn't going to jump on it.
I didn't deny anything. No, I actually, as I kind of say later, but I mean, I am not in any sense. I don't consider myself an atheist in any sense. I consider myself a religious person, but I don't believe in a God who is sitting there and making individual choices on cell divisions and microcosms within the cell and deciding what mutations will or will not be done at any particular time.
Would you consider yourself a theistic evolutionist, where God started the ball rolling with incredible design to manufacture and replicate itself?
Well, that's an interesting question. Where God was at the beginning is an interesting question. I would certainly say that if anything, it was in the creation of the fabric of the universe and the ways that the universe plays out. But I don't believe that God has a role in actually. I believe He has allowed for complete freedom and free will of how the universe plays out.
Including at the molecular level.
Including at the molecular level.
Okay. Response to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a theistic evolutionist. I would argue that God has intervened not only at the inception of the universe, but also throughout the universe's history. But I don't view God as tinkering, but rather God intervening as a way to show His care and His intimate involvement in the history of the universe. And because when we look at, for example, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, we see a God who is involving Himself in human history. Okay. And if that God who is the Redeemer of humanity is also the Creator, then would you not expect that God to also be intervening in the history of the universe as well? It doesn't mean that I don't think God has instituted processes that operate within the universe. God clearly has, and that's, I think, part of His providence. But even when it comes to the history of life on Earth, I don't dispute the idea that there are processes that microevolutionary processes, speciation. I think evolution is clearly conceivable even beyond the level of a species. I think microbial evolution is clearly well established. My question really is, can that process be extrapolated to an extreme to account for key transitions in life's history, the origin of life? I would even say the origin of eukaryotic cells, the origin of body plans. Those are places where I see those mechanisms of evolution just being deficient, and that there has to be something else going on. And those are places where I see God's intervention. Okay. But I don't see God tinkering in that sense, but rather as like an artist who's continually working on that painting that he's producing. He's not just throwing the paint up against the canvas, but he's constantly working and reworking that canvas to accomplish, the ultimate goal.
Okay, I'm going to throw the question back here in a similar fashion. Dr. Rana, Dr. Rana, what's the matter with you? How could you deny the established science for almost the vast majority of scientists in the academic spheres who have embraced the Darwinian model of evolution? I mean, who do you think you are? How could you deny this basic model that all these scientists are not insane or shooting hallucinogenic drugs? They've come to this conclusion based on scientific evidence. Not all of them are methodological naturalists. Some are actually believers. Yeah. Some are Muslims, some are Christians, some are Jewish. So your model seems to challenge that very position, does it not? So what's the matter with you?
Yeah, well, there's a significant portion of science that I embrace, but I don't embrace scientific ideas just simply because it's the consensus of the scientific community. I try as much as I can to think for myself, and so I embrace ideas because I think they are well evidenced. And, I don't dispute that, for example, and I would even argue that this idea that we don't have an explanation for the origin of life is actually a consensus position, even among origin of life researchers. It doesn't mean that they're not committed to trying to find some kind of mechanistic explanation for the origin of life, but I would argue even that skepticism I expressed is a consensus position. And I don't deny that organisms, again, share biological features. And I think it's not unreasonable to look at those shared features as reflecting common descent. But I think that common descent is not a unique explanation for those features. You could see them as evincing common design. And in fact, if you look at the history of biology, prior to Darwin, there was a prominent biologist by the name of Sir Richard Owen who was approaching biology in a teleological framework where he was trying to unite two schools of thought regarding function or form as being the most critical criteria for interpreting features in biology, and produced this concept of an archetype, where he argued that the archetype existed in the mind of a creator and then was functionally manifested in the created order, and explained why organisms that would naturally group together would share common form. And so those features that we understand as evidence for common descent could also be understood as evidence for common design. And Darwin appropriated this concept of homology that was elaborated by Sir Richard Owen and incorporated it into his evolutionary theory, and he replaced Owen's archetype with a hypothetical common ancestor. So my point is this, that it is possible to look at those features as reflecting the work of a designer. Now, that's obviously not a consensus position, but I think it's a legitimate interpretation of the data. And I think the reason why that idea is not entertained in biology has nothing to do with the deficiency of the idea. It has to do with the influence of methodological naturalism. That idea would not be entertained reasonably today because of methodological naturalism's influence.
And groupthink is not limited to religion. It's also in every major sphere, isn't it? Okay, so we have to challenge those things. All right, I have a lot more to say, but I'll hold on a little bit. How are we doing? Ron, another time? Okay, we got it. All right, so we have a lot more questions, but I want to open up the floor to you guys to do it. But we're going to give our closing statements by our guests, and then we'll go forward with that. So closing statement by, what was next?
Rana again.
Thank you very much. I actually want to start by saying that I really appreciate the way that Dr. Rana and the Reasons to Believe organization uses a type of scientific forensic style method to try and support their religious arguments. Too many people advocating creationism ignore and avoid any connection to scientific evidence, and so I really appreciate that. But that being said, it is still the case that the universe is filled with amazing and wonderful things, and this planet is filled with incredible and diverse forms of life, and that all of these things did not need to have a creator directly involved in designing their intricate, complex, and beautiful patterns. Placing constraints on scientific interpretations so that any result is ultimately in concordance with a particular written sacred text is, at its root, anti-scientific. Using God as the ultimate explanation for some structure or event or process seems both scientifically and intellectually dubious. It stifles the need for further scientific investigation and leads to paths that are ultimately untestable and unreproducible. Illustrating gaps in current understanding surrounding evolution or cell structure or the origin of life is a method often used to suggest that science is poorly dealing with observed data. But the lack of complete understanding is not a flaw in science. It is, in fact, an integral part of science. It's those holes in our knowledge that need to be probed, investigated, and questioned. It's the presence of those holes that stimulates our curiosity to explore the unknown. To me, God is not the explanation behind what we don't know, but rather God is in the driving curiosity and fascination that causes us to go and figure out the answers we don't know. It's true that scientists start with the understandings that explanations will be based on underlying natural, physical, and scientific principles, because science at its root is based on determining the way that the universe, as it currently is, works on a regular and consistent basis. Science explains the testable and reproducible. Other types of science of explanations might be lovely or meaningful, but they're not scientific. It's also important to understand that patterns and organizations need not be intrinsically a sign of a designer. For example, if you take an empty box and place disc magnets on the bottom of the box, kind of what I was getting to before, if you randomly just position them and then you close the box and you shake it, you'll end up with this nice little chain of magnets connected to each other. When you shake the box, matching poles repel, opposite poles attract, and you get this nice chain, not because there was any designer, but because of those intrinsic properties that underlie the way molecules interact with each other. So molecules, cells, and organisms deal with each other using these intrinsic properties of the universe. Similarly, the idea that physical constraints of the universe have been externally created and fine-tuned to be exactly what it is that we need in order for us to exist is really just kind of a red herring. We exist, we are here, and therefore, by definition, the universe we live in must be one in which we can exist. It's possible that other types of life can exist in other universes, but here we are, stuck in this one. It's not that the universe was made explicitly for us, but rather we have been selected. We are the children of the universe that is here. But it's important to remember that just because the process by which we arrived here may have been full of random occurrences does not mean that the universe which we came from has any less meaning. In fact, I consider myself to be a religious person, and I'm thrilled that this debate is in fact being performed at the start of Sukkot, the Jewish festival that celebrates thankfulness for God's blessings and presence in our lives. But the God I believe in does not make choices about chromosomal rearrangements, mutations, or turn on or off the temperatures during geologic epochs. Rather, we live in a universe that allows for and encourages change, a place where molecules can replicate themselves, cells can form colonies, birds can evolve to swim instead of fly, iguanas can evolve to eat in the ocean and sneeze out the salt, fish and crabs can evolve to weave a delicate balance between developing bright colors to find their mates and developing drab colors to hide from their predators. The universe we are in has quite the ability on its own to allow for creation of all of these creatures, as well as the creation of us, creatures that can look at ourselves, our planet, and the stars, and be filled with wonder and awe and joy. Or as Darwin himself once said, there's grandeur in this view of life, that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved.
Well, I too very much have enjoyed this interaction with Dr. Chon. And I really very much appreciate the fact that Olive Harvey is willing to host an event like this, because these are really very important questions to discuss. Because they're not just simply questions about, is there evidence for God's existence when we look at creation, but they're questions about really what constitutes the very nature of science and how does philosophy influence scientific investigation. And I think one of the concerns that many people have is if we go down a path of intelligent design, or if we view the world around us through the lens of a creation model, that we somehow are abandoning the scientific enterprise, or we're compromising the scientific enterprise. And I don't see that as the case whatsoever, because as I tried to show, intelligent design really is an integral part of certain scientific disciplines, and that there is a rigorous criteria that we can apply to systems in nature to determine whether or not those features reflect the activity or the work of an intelligent agent. And just as evolutionary biologists will extrapolate the mechanisms of microevolution and speciation to explain the broad history of life on Earth, likewise you can extrapolate those same processes that you would determine intelligent agency in a local scale in science to asking the broader question, is a creator's influence seen in certain elements or features of nature? And I think to deny that line of questioning is actually undermining the power of science to discover truth. As a scientist, I see the scientific method as a very powerful method that helps us to discover what is true about the world. But if we limit the explanations in science to only mechanistic explanations, in some instances science will discover the truth because mechanism is undergirding a particular feature of nature. But what if there really is an intelligent agent that is responsible for the origin of life? To not allow for that inquiry, I think, undermines the capacity for us to really know what is true about the world that we live in. And this, I think, does disservice to science. It renders science impotent, and it does a disservice, I think, to humanity. And I think it's a cop-out to say that if we go down the path of evoking a creator's handiwork to maybe explain the origin of life, that we somehow are shutting down scientific investigation. I just think we ask perhaps different questions, or we give emphasis to different questions. How did the creator bring about this purpose? Why did he bring about this purpose? And what I try to show in my presentation is that there are disciplines in technology and engineering that are intelligent design disciplines that are yielding some of the most significant advances that we're going to enjoy in the future to come. These are disciplines that are not flowing out of an evolutionary framework, but rather disciplines that are flowing out of a design framework that is hidden beneath the surface, but yet is still very much present in driving the work in biomimetics and bioinspiration and synthetic biology. And so, I think that at the end of the day, the key point here is this, that if you choose to see, if you choose to view nature in an objective manner, you can see what I believe to be clear evidence for a creator's fingerprints. and that is not just simply a religious expression, though it is a religious, has a profound religious significance, but it also, I think, has profound scientific implications, and to deny that area of investigation, I think, really does a disservice to the scientific enterprise. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have some time for now for Q&A, questions and answers. I have Olivia here moving around. She'll come to you as you raise your hand for your question. And Octavia, I'm sorry, Octavia. I said Olivia. Pardon me. Octavia's on her way. Just raise your hand, she'll come back. Keep your question concise, and focus it so we can move on to other people.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Chon. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You stated that you do believe in religion, and I'm really kind of feeling that you're contradicting yourself a little bit. Only reason because you stated that there is a religious perspective, but there also is a biological perspective as well. So my question to you is, if you do not believe in God, who are you? You stated that we are selected. So could you tell me who selected us?
All right, so I do believe in God. I don't believe, I believe in what I would say is a pretty, I'm among the group of progressive theology. I don't believe that God individually selects people. I believe people have come about, before I get it, so are you talking about individual people, or are you talking about how did humanity come about?
Creation.
So in humanity. So humanity came about due to natural adaptive processes that allowed humans to be more successful at dealing with the environment than other organisms around them, coming from other forms of primates that evolved. So I believe that humans came about in that way, and that each individual human has unique aspects that deal with the genes and the chromosomes that each individual has.
So if I may answer that question, so you do believe there is a designer behind it all?
I personally believe there is, which, how to put it? Well, how's the best way to put this? I believe that there are things greater than we know, and I believe that there are forces that can aid in that. I believe, but to me, it's really more of that I'm someone who believes that God is in the godliness we do. That the what we do to make the world a better place, and the things that we do to help each other, those are the acts that makes God manifest in the world.
Thank you, Professor. Next question, Octavia.
Yeah, I'm a math person, so I have two questions for you, Dr. Chon.
Okay?
And the first one would be for you, your colleagues, and yourself. And what was brought up in the affirmative portion of the affirmative side of the debate, forensic science, 1 out of 5 billion convinces a jury of 12 that the perpetrator's DNA matches, that's the person who's guilty. So for you and your colleagues, is there a burden of proof teleologically? In other words, to fine-tuning a probability that has been shown in peer-reviewed papers that would conclusively pass the threshold for you, saying that this is too improbable. The more rational conclusion is it had to be designed. That's the first question. What threshold will it have to be, or is there a threshold at all? What burden of proof to convince you otherwise? And the second question would be, theists get the criticism, God of the gaps. But atheism doesn't get as well. Oh, we have gaps in the scientific knowledge, and therefore atheism still is. It's atheism with the gaps, in other words. So that'd be the second one. I want, but more importantly, the first question.
Okay, so first, for your first question, I just want to get it. So are you talking about a threshold for what aspect of?
What would convince you? Teleologically.
That?
Is there a teleological threshold, the fine-tuning threshold that could be passed for your colleagues?
In terms of how cells work or DNA? I mean,
A design to infer, it would be more rational to believe that the design took place.
What would it take for you to believe that there is a designer behind the complexities that we see in DNA or others? Is that what you're asking?
At this point, I don't think there could be, because I see within the biological realm that there are a huge range of complexities. That is, there isn't anything I see currently within the biological realm that could not have come about by a selection process. I mean, if at some point I observe something that I think could never have come about, I suppose, but I don't see, everything I see, everything I observe, everything I talk to other colleagues about, every part of biology has a regularity to it that connects back to the earliest life forms in a way that's very continuous and easily transferable.
And that probably answers the second part, which is atheism in the gaps part. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any questions for Dr. Rana? Up there. Question for Dr. Rana?
Yes, I do. Excuse me. My question is, it is said a lot of times in either the Bible or in many religions or even myths about beings with a higher power or a higher state of intelligence. They say that these higher beings are so highly intelligent or highly advanced that it's impossible for us to even relate or understand their thought processes or their how they understand things in a certain way. And a lot of times they tell us in the Bible that God has a lot of times has to explain it in a way that we can understand it. So one of my questions is, if that's the case, how can we detect his involvement in the design if we only understand if we only understand things, basing things on our own understanding and abilities?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. A couple of things. One is when you look at the Old and the New Testaments, there are many places where it describes God making himself known to us. So God has specifically done things to make himself known to us. This is called revelation. And one way is through what we have as represented in the Old and the New Testament. That's referred to as special revelation by theologians. It's referring to the fact that God has specifically intervened in human history in specific ways at specific times, and that has been recorded in what represents the Old and the New Testaments. If you are a Christian, you believe that God has also revealed himself to us through the person of Christ. That's also part of special revelation. But there's also this idea of general revelation, that God has made himself known to us through the record of nature. And so the expectation then is that when we look at the record of nature, we should see evidence for God's fingerprints. And so the question is, can we develop a rigorous set of criteria that will help us to detect God's fingerprints? But clearly, if this is part of revelation, then even though God is beyond our capacity to understand, we still should be able to see fingerprints for that revelation. In my book, The Cell's Design, I point out that human beings are described in the Judeo-Christian scriptures as being made in God's image. And I take that as to mean that we have certain aspects of our nature that are reflected, that are reflections of God's character and God's nature and God's capacity. Not that we're God-like, but that we reflect that through the image of God to some degree, imperfectly and partially. But if that's the case, then we would expect that when we create, what we do as a creator being made in God's image would somehow connect with what God has done as creator, which I think gives a theological undergirding to the watchmaker argument that I was presenting.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Hello, I have a question for Dr. Foss. As a philosophy student, I'm supposed to ask questions about anything that doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm just trying to ask some questions. I got two questions in short, so I'm just going to ask. My first question is that what is your definition of supernatural creator? Like in your opening statement, you said there is a supernatural, if I'm not saying it wrong, you said there's a supernatural creator in this world. What is your exact definition of the supernatural creator or God?
Yeah, I would, when I think of that term, I would think of it, the definition as being consistent with Christian theism, where it's a supernatural creator that transcends the universe, that exists independent of the universe, that establish the laws of nature that govern the universe, but he's also a creator that while he's outside of the universe can also intervene and interact within the universe itself. So it's yeah.
You had a second question?
Yes. The other question that I have and I want to ask is that right now if a farmer wants to grow a plant, he knows that he should add some chemicals to it, so it will grow faster. But like 50 years ago, if someone wanted to grow a plant, they would say, okay, let's buy the seed and pray, so the plant will grow faster. You know what I'm talking about. What I'm going to say is that, what's your opinion about this issue that if you don't have a reason for something, we can say God did that?
Yeah.
What is your opinion about this?
Yeah,
Thank you.
and you're bringing up essentially the God of the gap critique. And what I tried very hard to do, I actually think that that's a valid criticism, that to just simply insert God when we don't have understanding is fallacious reasoning. And I've actually tried very hard, not only in my opening statement, but also in the work that I've done in this area to avoid God of the gap reasoning. So that's why I pointed out that there are three criteria that we need to use to establish the work of intelligent agency in nature. First is, do we see the appearance of design? If we see design, that's positive evidence for the work of a designer. Can we see what it takes to produce that particular feature? That's essentially doing experimental work to try to establish what does it take to produce or to replicate those design features, and can that experimental work demonstrate that natural processes are capable of doing that, yes or no? If the answer is yes, then I think, as Dr. Cohn would say, then you would rule out the idea that it's supernatural design at least through direct intervention. Maybe God could have done it through process. And it's only then that you look at the third criteria, which is, are there natural process explanations? That's a place where you're now evaluating what are the explanations mechanistically. And if you can show that those mechanisms or those explanations come up short, then I think you have a legitimate reason to conclude design. So it's not God of the gaps reasoning, but it's actually abductive reasoning to the best explanation based on three sets of independent lines of reasoning.
We call that positive evidence, right?
Yeah, so I would say it's a positive argument.
Octavia, next.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
So basically, if things can't be explained, then there's a higher power, basically. So does that mean scientifically, because you're obviously a doctor in science, so you're saying you believe in science, but to a certain degree, and then you believe in your religion, but to a certain degree, that a higher power created, but only because you don't know right now what is. So my question is, is it only that you say there's a higher power because you don't really know the answer right now, and that's the only possible answer we give ourselves to make ourselves feel good? Or is it legitimately you believe that there's a higher power, but your science is like not that truthful then?
Right. Yeah, I don't see science and my faith as being at odds with each other, but I see them as fully integrated. And I think that science can inform my faith and my faith can inform science, that there's this dynamic interplay that goes on. And so I view my faith as being evidential. I was an agnostic when I started graduate school, and it was studying biochemical systems and looking at origin of life models that convinced me that there had to be a creator that brought life into existence. And it was 6 months later that I converted to Christianity. And since that time, I've constantly asked myself, is Christianity true? And there are ways in which you can evaluate claims that come from Scripture, scientifically and historically, through archaeological studies. And I've yet to see a situation where the Christian faith has been falsified from science, from history, from, again, archaeology, from just application of logic, principles of logic. I've yet to see it being falsified. So to me, I'm constantly putting my faith to the test, but I'm also approaching my studies in science from the standpoint of a Christian, where I expect there to be a creator that's intervened, and I'm willing to allow for science to open up that possibility. So there's still unanswered questions that I have biblically and theologically and scientifically, and I'm vigorously exploring those answers to those questions, and I'm willing to follow the evidence where it goes.
Okay. Do you have a rejoinder to that, Professor?
Well, I was going to say, I also feel like, for me, I have integrated my religion and my science, but for me, the religion doesn't tell me where my science goes. The religion tells me what experiments or what to do that are most important to the world around me. That is, what can I do that will make a difference? So it's that my religion helps me determine what is meaningful, but it doesn't tell me the temperature I should be running my experiment in.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
This is for Dr. Chon. Coming from your argument, do you believe that there is ultimately, well, excuse me, not ultimately, but there's a spiritual influence over creation as a whole?
I believe the creation process is one that is dynamic and amazing, and I think that we can gain meaning and value from it. I mean, again, I see that there is, that to me, the whole process of biology, the amazing, wonderful things that I see in it every day, is something that gives me awe and joy and delight. And in that sense, I see that is something which gives my life meaning and purpose. But so in that sense, it's very spiritual to me, and I think that, I don't know, I mean, for me, I see spiritual meaning in doing those things that I think are important to make the world better. I'm not sure if that answered the question. Yes, I'll say yes.
My question is somewhat for both. I would just like to know what you believe, or if you do believe in the afterlife, what you believe it is exactly, and what do you believe occurs in the afterlife, if you do believe in that.
Whoa, that was not what I was expecting. All right. For me, I believe that you become part of something that's greater and more amazing than you could ever imagine before. I don't believe in literal gates there where you're knocking and they're asking questions at the. I believe that you, in a sense, have an immortality because of the things that you have left behind, the people that you know, the things that you've done, the way you've changed the world. Everything you do changes something in some way. Everything you do makes a difference. And when you go, those things are always left behind.
Okay. Question?
She asked for both of them.
As a Christian, I would hold to the Christian view of the afterlife. So I believe that I'm going to remain a distinct personality, and that because I've embraced the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, I believe that I'm going to be in His presence for all of eternity in the new heavens and the new earth. So that's my perspective on the afterlife.
If I may challenge this, in philosophy we want to challenge that. What makes your views, both of you, what you said is interesting, any more true than the flying spaghetti monster, if I may quote Richard Dawkins? Just because you believe it doesn't make it true. A lot of people believe a lot of interesting, crazy things that get them through the night. Sigmund Freud talked about it, called the wish fulfillment argument. What makes what you believe actually true of what you're saying?
For me, I don't know if it's true. I mean, I certainly hold it as nothing that is in any way scientifically provable or real.
Or just logically provable?
No, it's simply kind of an internal faith. It's not. I don't put my sense of the afterlife in terms of what I believe scientifically.
Thank you. Professor, or Dr. Rana, excuse me.
The concept of faith as it applies to Christianity is often misunderstood. Many people understand faith in a Christian context as kind of blind belief, right? Blind hope. But the fact of the matter, when you look at the word in the Greek that's translated as faith, it's essentially involving acting on established evidence. And so when I look at the Old and the New Testaments, I see correspondence between scientific discoveries and what the biblical text teaches about God's work as creator. I see historical and archaeological evidence. I think you can make a very powerful historical case for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so while I don't have proof for Christian, what's going to happen to me when I die, Scripture describes enough information that I can at least piece together some concept of what's going to happen to me after I die. But I'm confident in that it is true, because every place else that I can put the Old and the New Testament to the test, it passes it. So on that basis, I transfer that confidence to what I can't prove. So I would argue my faith is established in fact.
Okay, thank you.
My question was, in the Bible, would certain things be exaggerated, or are things always facts?
Can you repeat that with your mouth closer to the mic? Okay.
In the Bible, would certain things be considered exaggerations, or is everything a fact in there?
You asking me?
Which Both. Is everything in the Bible exaggerated? Can things be interpreted as fact? Is that the question?
Yes.
I believe that I read the Bible literally. But what that means is that when I'm reading the Bible, I'm paying attention to the literary genre of a particular book in the Bible. I'm paying attention to the historical context. I try to understand it as best as I can in terms of the original language. And I also recognize that there are literary devices at work, that there are things like hyperbole and comparisons and things like that are in play. And so there may be places where the Bible is exaggerating something, but that may actually be part of the literary device that's being used by the author to drive home a point. So when somebody says that they read the Bible literally, it doesn't mean that they're reading it concretely or woodenly. They are reading it according, again, to the literary genre, the historical context, the historical setting, the author's intent, the original language, literary devices, those types of things.
And this is called, by the way, hermeneutics. There's a $10 word for you. Hermeneutics is a science of interpreting scripture in the context of that it was originally written as much as possible. Hermeneutics. Be interesting, look that up. Any final, we have time for one more question. Hand in the back.
Adam.
You have it here? Okay, so 2 more and we're done. Then we'll be meeting for refreshments, and you can have some interaction with our scholars one-on-one.
Okay, you both do come across the term of natural. You say non-natural, Dr. Khan, and you say supernatural. What do you all mean by natural? What are your personal definitions of natural?
So by natural, I mean those occurrences that, those processes that occur without any supernatural intervention. Those things that happen due to the intrinsic properties of the molecules and atoms, the universe.
I would say that natural would refer to the processes that are that regularly occur, that are part of the created order. So in theological terms, I would see these as laws and processes that God has ordained, that God has put into play, that then God lets run their course.
Answer your question? I assume that would include hurricanes.
It would. That's a different topic.
That's a whole different topic. Final question was up there. Let's go. Okay.
So I just have a question. Do you think the narrative that there is not a designer is like impacting society in a negative way? Because it's pretty clear that you don't have all the answers to everything. So this is to both of you guys. Do you believe that the narrative that there is no designer and there is an explanation for everything, do you think it's hindering or helping society?
A good question to end on. What are the implications of what you believe?
Did you want to go first?
I mean, I think that you have to be careful between the difference between, in my mind, meaning and science. So when you say that there's a narrative that there's no designer, I think that saying that, from my perspective, that there's not a designer who directly is intervening at every point in people's lives does not mean that there's no meaning or purpose to the universe, or in other words, there's a difference between meaning and scientific process. And I think that there is meaning to people's actions, to the universe, to many things. There's values, but that's different than the scientific process by which you investigate how actual activities come about.
I would take a differing perspective on that question. I think that when you adopt a position that there is no designer that has orchestrated the history of life on Earth, or that's responsible in some capacity for the advent of humanity, it really is a logical extension into a metaphysical realm where you would conclude there is no ultimate meaning or purpose for human life, and there is no ultimate intrinsic value to a human being, that a human being is really ultimately no different than any other creature that has ever existed in Earth's history. That is, there are many evolutionary biologists who embrace an atheistic perspective who drive that point home. Now, I'm not saying everybody who's part of the scientific community would assent to those metaphysical implications, but those are not unreasonable metaphysical implications to draw from that. But the problem is that that message does permeate our culture. And I think sadly, I think we live in a culture in the West that is a culture of death increasingly. And I think that co-option of science to support that is very real. And so to me, I do think that saying there is no designer does have consequences that play out in society tragically. So I don't think that this is a debate, as I said, that's without consequence.
There are consequences to it.
And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not attributing that view to Dr. Chon or to many people in the scientific community who would be atheists, who would reject the notion of a designer, but there are scientists who make that metaphysical implication, and it's not unwarranted.
Okay, thank you. Please thank our panelists. With that said, ideas do have consequences. Make yours count in a positive way. Thank you. A little logistics for those of you who are students. There is a sign-up sheet in the back so you can get credit.